Good evening, everyone. Hello. For those of you that don't know me, my name is Monika Biscay. I'm the Demo Curator of 20th and 21st Century Design here at the Milwaukee Art Museum. And I have the pleasure of welcoming everyone to the museum on this occasion of this public event in conversation, design, and disability. And it is a privilege for the museum to act as a forum for important conversations like this. I'd like to thank this evening's sponsor, the Chipstone Foundation, for supporting this event. And I'd also like to note, for those of you that are interested, Bess will be signing copies of her book in the museum shop after the event. So please don't miss that. Our convener this evening is Natalie Wright, who is a curatorial fellow at the Chipstone Foundation. Wright completed her MA at the Winterthur Program in American Material Culture and received her BA from the University of Toronto. She was responsible for the display of functional fashions, and I encourage those of you that haven't seen the installation in the design galleries at the museum to please go and view them. She has also contributed to the exhibitions Apartment 4, Iris Hausler, and the Chipstone Foundation, Florence Eiseman, Designing Childhood for the American Century, and Mrs. M's Cabinet. Wright has published on the history of clothing for persons with disabilities. So I'm going to turn this over to Natalie, who will introduce the rest of tonight's participants.
Thank you, Monika, for the introduction and for all of the generous support that you've given me on this display, alongside Hannah Paivo and so many others here at the Milwaukee Art Museum. Today, I'm thrilled to introduce our two panelists, my colleagues and mentors, Dr. Bess Williamson and Liz Jackson. Dr. Williamson is a historian of design and material culture. Her work examines social and political concerns in design, including environmental, labor, justice, and rights issues as they shape and are shaped by spaces and things. Her new book, Accessible America, A History of Disability and Design from NYU Press, traces the history of design responses to disability rights from 1945 to recent times, and it is a terrific publication. Dr. Williamson is an associate professor of art history, theory, and criticism at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago. Her work and advice have been critical to the research presented in the Functional Fashions display. Liz Jackson is the founder of the Disabled List, a disability-led self-advocacy organization that is creating new paradigms of design with disabled expertise. She's also the co-founder of Thyssen, an audio-to-text platform that transcribes speech in real time. As a disability advocate and design strategist, Liz offers her perspectives on disability design to such audiences as the Obama White House, the Sydney Opera House, Creative Mornings, 99U, and more. Liz is also my collaborator on the Functional Fashions project. Before we jump into our panel discussion, I would like to briefly introduce the Functional Fashions line, and Bess and Liz will then respond by presenting on some of their work about disability and design. The Functional Fashions line existed from 1955 to 1976 and unravels the myth that there is no history of clothing designs for disabled persons. Not only was Functional Fashions created for disabled bodies, but it involved nearly 30 of the United States' best designers whose brands ranged from high-end sportswear such as Vera Maxwell, Pauline Trigère, and Lacoste, to everyday labels like Levi's. What's more, industry leaders were behind Functional Fashions, including designer Helen Cookman, whose own disability was hearing loss, New York Times style editor Virginia Pope, and the chairman of Bergdorf Goodman. Functional Fashions is a window into theories of rehabilitation and independence in post-war America. It began when Helen Cookman embarked on a 5-year research residency at New York University's Institute of Physical Medicine and Rehabilitation. Alongside Dr. Howard Rusk and occupational therapist Muriel Zimmerman, Helen Cookman studied the clothing requirements and desires of patients at the Institute, using this data to conceive of solutions such as shorter suit jackets to eliminate the discomfort that longer jackets often cause wheelchair users, action pleats on women's jackets to allow for easier arm movement. The goal of these garments was to help users dress and undress themselves, a signifier of autonomy when the post-war notion of independence prized total self-reliance. Helen Cookman created a pilot line of functional fashions with the belief that beautiful, accessible clothes would provide psychological rehabilitation for the wearer. Thousands of Americans wrote in to inquire about purchasing options, leading Helen to begin the Clothing Research and Development Foundation with the goal of encouraging other designers to incorporate her innovative construction features into their lines. A functional fashions tag was added to these garments, as well as to ensembles that were already deemed functional, such as Bonnie Cashin's signature creations. For over 20 years, consumers could find beautiful clothes for disabled users that, for the first time, did not require alterations and which were not in a medical device supply store. Functional Fashions was the largest collaborative effort to create clothing by, with, and for disabled persons in American history. Yet after Helen Cookman and Virginia Pope passed away, it ended and has been largely forgotten. For these reasons and many more, I'm delighted to begin unpacking the significance of this history with Bess and Liz and all of you. Thanks.
Thank you, Natalie. Thank you, all of you. How is the sound? Thank you all for participating in that question. So thank you, more thank yous to the museum here for having us, and particularly to Natalie for bringing this project to all of our attention, and always happy to be up on the stage with Liz Jackson, who is my constant interlocutor around issues of design, disability, and disability rights. So I'm going to just talk a little bit about the context in which functional fashions came out, which is covered in my book that I've self-promotingly put the cover of on the screen. In 1966, a legal scholar named Jacobus Tenbroek wrote a manifesto of sorts titled The Right to Live in the World. In it, Tenbroek, who was blind, argued that it was fundamental to U.S. constitutional law that all people have access to spaces, places, and experiences that we know of as life in public. By defining disabled people's rights through the idea of living in the world, Tenbroek brought particular attention to the way that the world was built. Quote, some difficulties in getting about arise out of the conditions of the modern world in combination with a particular disability, as in the case of the deaf person in traffic, he wrote, right, suggesting that disability was a kind of co-production of modern life and one's physical condition. Quote, for the persons in a wheelchair or the mobile cripple, a site is best developed which is level and without curbs and other abrupt changes. For the blind, large level open plazas without discernible landmarks such as curbs and well-defined walks can be traversed only by dead reckoning. Right, so in both cases, defining a connection between the built environment and a disability. And so I start with Tenbroek here because I want us to enter into thinking about designing for disability in terms of the ways in which design participates in either allowing or blocking access to life in the world. I also start there because Tenbroek was writing around the same time period as that's covered by Functional Fashions and by this important exhibition. Functional Fashions was a program developed as a partnership between a disabled fashion designer, Helen Cookman, and the premier site for rehabilitation research of the post-war United States, post-World War II era, the New York Institute for Physical Medicine and Rehabilitation, which was founded in 1948 by Dr. Howard Rusk. Rusk's institute was deeply committed to design as a component of rehabilitation. He and his specialists approached the physical environment as a crucial component of the experience of disability and an important tool for moving people out of recovery and into work or home life. Rusk titled his own memoir, Rehabilitation from Bed to Job, suggesting that rehabilitation is a kind of spatial transition. And here is a carefully folded plan of the Institute that Rusk showed funders when he was first seeking to establish the Institute, when he returned from being a doctor in the Second World War. It shows a path of rehabilitation that passes through distinct physical environments that are meant to prepare disabled people for life outside the hospital. So, we can think of this as distinct from sites that sought to house disabled people for the rest of their lives, like institutions. A patient enters a rehabilitation program and is assessed in 3 categories. Hard to see up at the top, but the physical, medical, psychosocial, or vocational. So these are the 3 components that Rusk called the whole man treatment, from the start of one's physical condition always being combined with psychological state and future potential for job placement. So I'm going to narrow in on this image a little bit to show the meat of this process, which is the specifically designed spaces that were a part of rehabilitation. Each of these environments, these little sort of work rooms here, shows a different space, very carefully designed. For example, there are furnished spaces that resemble an office of the period, or cultural spaces with art supplies and reading books. Reading was an important part of rehabilitation from Rusk's perspective, as well as maybe what we might expect, more physical therapy, gym type of environments. Rusk was insistent in particular that the residential wards, which you see up here, look like typical home spaces. He even had his own interior designer perform the work of selecting fabrics, lamps, and rugs so that it would be a kind of up-to-date space. So we can see a quaint little living room space with stuffed armchairs, side tables with vases, and a stocked bookshelf right up here, right? He did this for 2 reasons. First, Rusk said that the different heights and textures of furniture and rugs would help patients practice walking, sitting, and getting in and out of bed. But he also felt that these interiors would clearly broadcast the message that life in the hospital was not the disabled person's future, but that life outside, especially including productive work, would be the outcome of rehabilitation. So Functional Fashions was one of several programs that Rusk and his team of physical and occupational therapists took up to build an accessible world for that outside of the hospital life. When the Institute opened in 1948, there were virtually none of the forms of disability accommodation that we know today. No ramps, kneeling buses, elevators into the subway, wheelchair-accessible bathroom stalls, parking spaces, and so on. The laws requiring these accommodations were still decades away, starting in earnest in the 1970s. So as Rusk specifically noticed, there were few products or appliances available to make daily tasks in the house easier in particular. So Rusk found that working with disabled women drew his attention to the domestic environment as a site of many built-in barriers. Rusk reflected in a New York Times article, for example, that the, quote, handicapped homemaker, a population that he estimated at 5 million women, quote, could not fully meet their responsibilities because of disabilities. So he lamented that while much work had been done to adapt workplaces, factory equipment, and so on, that there hadn't been enough done for women in their workplace, the home. So when the Institute established its facilities in 1948, Rusk recruited Lillian Gilbreth, a leading expert on domestic work and kitchen design, to contribute to the new space. Gilbreth was a doctor of industrial psychology who had established her career in the 1920s working with her husband on efficiency in factories. Much to her dismay, her greatest fame is that her children wrote the book Cheaper by the Dozen about their household and failed to describe their mother as a professional expert on industrial design. But nonetheless, after Frank's death in the 1920s, Lillian became a true expert in household management, designing kitchen and laundry spaces that would minimize superfluous movement, sort of reserving energy for this workspace. And the kitchen at the Institute for Physical Medicine and Rehabilitation showed many familiar details of her career. Things like easy-to-reach dish racks, wheel under flexible counter spaces that could be folded up for small kitchens and so on were sort of familiar elements from her repertoire. She placed items within a narrow range of reach, so a dishwasher on a platform and space under the sink to allow a wheelchair to pass. And the lowest image here at the bottom shows a similar kitchen at the Rancho Los Amigos Hospital, which was Los Angeles County's biggest polio hospital, so reflects the national influence of these models. They're not just happening in Rusk's Institute. So it was not a big surprise to me that Rusk partnered with top designers like Helen Cookman and the companies that are represented by Functional Fashions, because to me this seems to be a similar project as the functional kitchen or a functional home, which was a sort of broader expansion of it. That while neither the fashions nor the home projects exclusively focused on women, they had a particular attention on the idea of a return to a typical life as a homemaker, a wife, a mother, and so on. So these rehabilitation projects raise important historical questions for us about what kind of access these medical specialists sought to make. Rusk and his collaborators were groundbreaking in focusing on the built environment rather than just the individual bodies of disabled people. Still, I can't understate how intense the pressure was on Rusk's patients to prove their worth in these productive kind of spaces. Rusk framed these kitchens as vocational designs above all, creating a workspace for women to return to their conventional roles that were expected of them in the 1950s. Functional kitchens and functional fashions both fit within a range of other devices that aggressively reshaped people's bodies during rehabilitation. Here, 2 photographs document braces created for a young woman with polio at Rancho Los Amigos. The steel waist and arm braces allow her to stand up straight and most likely hold her hands still, particularly for eating. Rancho Los Amigos patented a number of these braces, aiming specifically for people to be able to feed themselves rather than rely on assistance. And I've always found it impossible, looking at these photographs, to ignore the young woman's expression of discomfort. Perhaps it's the braces themselves or just the situation of being photographed, documented, and filed away in the records. Now I find myself also revisiting this photograph and looking at her dress. Right? I'm quite sure this isn't a functional fashions piece. I guess we can't know for sure, but its buttoned front is sort of typical for the time. And its pleats make this familiar kind of typically feminine but not too revealing silhouette of a young woman's dress of the time. But it prompts us to think about functional fashions among a constellation of objects that were used by disabled people but also used upon them, especially in the era of public attention to major disability-related issues like the return of disabled veterans and the polio epidemic. For people who used these things, did they represent freedom or constraint? Did they give an avenue to personal mobility, to style, to taste, to pleasure? Or in the case of this young woman, pressure to perform the expectations of their caregivers? In the case, we might wonder with her particularly that with a beautifully draped cloak or an adjustable Velcro dress, would she have felt more comfortable? Would she have designed something like that for herself, sitting with a sewing machine or a friend with a sewing machine at home away from the eyes of her doctors? I think it's important to keep these questions in mind as we explore functional fashions along with the kitchens, houses, braces, splints, crutches, iron lungs, and prosthetic limbs that were designed for this generation of disabled Americans. They allow us to piece together a sense of what it was like to live in the world as a disabled person in the 20th century. So thank you for Natalie and Liz for bringing this project to light, and let's spend more time talking about it.
Hi, how's the sound? It's good? So my name is Liz Jackson. I am the founder of an organization. Actually, you know what? Before I get into what I do, I want to speak quickly about language. So some of you might notice that we are saying disabled person rather than person with disability. This was a conscious choice. that we made together. So there's two types of ways you can really kind of refer to disability. Person first means that you are a person before your disability. A disabled person, on the other hand, it means that you are part of a community with a culture. And I very much identify as disabled. So I want to thank Natalie and Bess and everybody involved for allowing this to be an Identity First panel. And yeah, so I'm the founder of an organization called the Disabled List. What we do is we engage in disability as a creative practice. So this means that we ask hard questions such as who gets to design, who gets credit for design, and we advocate. But my organization wasn't always called the Disabled List. It actually started out as an organization called the Inclusive Fashion and Design Collective. And what we did is we had branded ourselves as, and I quote, the first ever fashion trade association for people with disabilities. So again, at the time, I was person first, I'm now identity first, but the key word in that is actually first. And so as we shifted to the disabled list, and as we became, the reason I shifted to the disabled list is because what would happen is I would go into situations as a disabled designer, and I would find that I would get my role would be diminished. Oftentimes due to my disability, I would enter as an expert, and then I would be treated as a user. And oftentimes my role in a situation would be diminished, and I wouldn't get what I felt was appropriate credit. And so that was really kind of the guise under which we shifted from the Inclusive Fashion and Design Collective to the Disabled List. And so really one of the things that we primarily focused on doing is questioning. And this is something that has come extremely easily to me. So I got a desk in this wonderful office. It's an architecture firm. I sit across the table from an industrial designer. I oftentimes jokingly refer to him as the world's most industrial designer. He's just this hilarious guy. His name is Tucker Veermeister. And I don't know if you guys know OXO kitchen products. They're like those kitchen products with like the gummy tactile handle. So Tucker, he invented the grip. He invented the good grips. As a disabled person in the design space, I'd become very familiar with OXO and the story behind OXO. Do you guys know the story behind OXO kitchen products at all? So if you go on their website, what you'll read is a story where Sam Farber saw that his wife was having a hard time peeling a carrot because of her arthritis. And so he decided he was going to make an easier peeler for her to use, and thus the birth of OXO kitchen products. And I always was sort of curious about Betsy, and so this one day I just happened to ask Tucker. I said, Tucker, can you tell me about Betsy? And Tucker was like, yeah. He's like, did you know she was a designer? And I said, no, I didn't know she was a designer. He was like, yeah. He's like, she was around all the time. And I started thinking about it, and it just struck me that I can't think of a designer in my life, in my world, that would just let her husband just inspirationally design something for her. And so I decided to call her up on the phone. And the very first thing she said to me is that she's going to go down in history as being Sam's lowly, crippled wife, and it was actually her idea in the first place. And so, and this isn't the only story. There are a lot of stories of disabled participation, disabled-led design, where we actually don't get that credit. And I'll sort of spare you a longer history of that. But I have a friend. His name is Lawrence Carter Long. And he is an incredible advocate. He's done incredible work in the disability space. And he loves to shop on eBay. And he one day happened across a book called Functional Fashions for the Physically Handicapped, and he bought it for me. And so I get it in the mail, and I open it up, and I couldn't believe what was in front of me. And so the first thing I did is I first kind of looked into the book, into the Rusk archives, and ultimately I sought out Helen Cookman, who created the book, her grandsons. And they had mentioned to me that there was somebody else that had recently approached them, Natalie Wright, who had also taken an interest in Helen. And so I sought her out. And in my first call with her, we came to discover that we had a mutual mentor and friend. So that's actually sort of how this story came to be. But I want to go back to this idea of first. And I'm actually going to quote, I first want to quote Natalie on something. So there was a recent blog post on the Milwaukee Art Museum, and this is what Natalie wrote as the opening paragraph. She said, "The mistaken belief that there is no history of clothing designs for disabled users has had a number of repercussions. Among them, nearly all designers treat their own iterations as inaugural. There has been a dearth of innovation as designs are continually repeated, and disability-led innovation is written out of the historical record." Again, so being somebody who identifies as identity first, right? I'm a part of a community first. I've found that there's been so much joy and just delight in this process. So there were a couple weeks ago, Natalie and I were texting back and forth. And Natalie said that she was really interested in this idea of, so it's the word finally, and what was the other word? Do you know what I'm, so like finally, I can't remember what the other word was, but there's this.
Oh, I think at last.
At last, yeah.
Yeah.
So whenever there's sort of a new disability innovation that comes out, you sort of see these kind of keywords. And I realized like it would be really interesting to kind of look into the way that disability has been sort of written out of the historical record. And so there is an article from just a couple months ago in February of 2019. It was titled, "Adaptive Fashion Has Been a Thing Long Before Selma Blair Came Into the Picture." So Selma Blair has come out and announced that she's going to make a disability fashion line. And this is one of the paragraphs in it, and I find it just so striking. It says, "The invention or recognition of adaptive clothing started to become mainstream in the 1980s when caregivers and loved ones of disabled people realized the need for easy-to-wear clothing. So certain manufacturers and distributors began to design and create specific garments for people with limited mobility." And again, so they, in this article that is saying that Selma Blair is not the first, they say that this starts in the 1980s when very clearly Helen Cookman started this work and passed away in the 1970s. But if you fast forward 3 years before, and again, you have to realize this idea of being the first, it was also my instinct, right? Like this isn't anything anybody's doing wrong. Like I created what I had called at the time was the first ever fashion trade association. And so this is what happens as you enter the space. You kind of you don't have access to who came before. And so this was a separate article that came out 3 years before. It was an op-ed in Time magazine by a woman named Mindy Shire who created a clothing company called Runway of Dreams. "Today marks the start of this movement as we launch the Runway of Dreams and Tommy Hilfiger collaboration, the first ever collaboration to bring adaptive clothing directly to consumers." And so I think much of my interest in Helen is really sort of also striving to understand my instincts in this space and everybody else's instincts in this space. Even today, you know, I've already taken to calling Helen the first, but even today, Natalie and I were talking about something we both know, which is that there was work happening before Helen at the Department of Agriculture. And then if we say, okay, well, this work started first at the Department of Agriculture, then we don't acknowledge all of the people who made accommodations to their clothing on their own. And so, you know, this is a question of like, when does something start and what leads to the next thing, leads to the next thing, and how is it that we can begin to trace it back? So thank you.
Thank you both so much. Bess, I wonder if you can start us off by discussing the meaning of rehabilitation in post-war America. It's something quite different from what we think of today, and I'm especially curious about the way someone could be described as rehabilitated, because that was the focus of the functional fashions line.
Yeah, I'm happy to just give a little bit of a historical backdrop, of course. I mean, first to just say that rehabilitation itself was a fairly new field in the 1940s and the 1950s when these projects were first beginning. The field of rehabilitation medicine was first recognized by the American Medical Association in 1947, so it's really coming out of World War II. But we can think of basically the claim that you're not done when you've seen a surgeon or a doctor about whatever sort of acute medical situation you may be experiencing, but that there's a longer term process. And so many of the professions that we're familiar with today, occupational therapy, physical therapy, in particular, were sort of shadow professions at this moment and start to become more kind of official at this time. And two major phenomena sort of fuel this and make it, I think, a more legitimate medical practice. The return of disabled veterans from World War II and a kind of concern that they might be kind of stuck with nothing to do or fall idle or become depressed, as we now know, along a common experience of returning from war, but also the polio epidemic, which kind of peaked in the 1950s, and is considered by many to be kind of over in 1955 with the advent of a polio vaccine, but of course many people are still living with the effects of polio. And children with polio are a particular kind of press and charitable focus at this time as seen as sort of the most deserving of rehabilitation. But the question of what it means to be rehabilitated, is an ongoing moving target. But as I mentioned in my remarks, is very much focused on specific tasks in the world, and it often comes with this real focus on what you can and can't do that's measured through what we would think of as design, like telephones, typewriters, right? Can you board a bus? And there's like mock-ups of these inside of these hospitals where you have to kind of go through a kind of obstacle course. We can think about how that, therefore, what is considered to be rehabilitated is sort of based on what's considered to be normal function in the broader world, which itself changes with design change.
Thanks so much, Bess. And turning to Helen Cookman, I'm wondering how she came to this, to functional fashions, and really what the significance of her own disability is, hearing loss, in the functional fashions line.
So, there's things that I can probably say we probably know. So we know that Howard Rusk, who had his rehabilitation center, he had taken an interest in fashion. He wanted to create a functional fashions line. And so what we presume probably happened is he turned to Virginia Pope, who Virginia Pope ran the style section of the New York Times. And I can imagine what Virginia Pope, what immediately came to her mind. She probably thought to herself, oh, I know the perfect person. So who was the perfect person? Well, up until, I'd say, like the late 1930s, really, maybe into the 1940s, Helen had been a fashion designer who had a deep interest in, and we call it functionality. I don't know if that's maybe the appropriate term, but she made apparel that worked for women. There was an aviator outfit that comes to mind. And she aged into disability. She experienced hearing loss as she aged. And hearing aids at the time, there was the piece that went into the ear, and then there was a wire that draped down, and then there was a box that contained the battery and equipment that you wore around your waist. And what Helen had begun to do is she had begun sewing these holders for herself, for her hearing aid, onto her waist. And so I can imagine that when Howard Rusk had approached Virginia Pope, she probably thought, oh, Helen would be great for this because she's already doing this for herself. I think that's where it gets really murky for us because, it's interesting. She enters this rehab space. She has a focus. The images you saw where the clothing was made for wheelchair users. You saw a man on crutches. And it seems on just about every level, hearing loss and her hearing aid played very little role in that. And I think that's one of the things that we kind of tinker back and forth with trying to better understand. I think her hearing loss gave her entry into the space. I think it gave her a specific point of view. But I do wonder if in the process her own disability was erased for something that was deemed functional fashions for the physically handicapped. I don't know if she saw herself as physically handicapped.
And Bess, I think in one of our previous conversations, you mentioned that at the time there was sort of a distinction between deafness and other types of disability.
Yeah, I mean, interesting to think about it in this way, in this particular historical case. But certainly, I mean, even today, there are sort of ongoing questions about sort of, are there shared characteristics among a broader population of people with disabilities, right? But particularly of whether deaf people identify as disabled or not. And especially aging-related disabilities often sort of fall into a different category. But I can't help but think, and of course I don't know, but I can't help but think that when Rusk asked Virginia Pope, Rusk also had a regular column in the New York Times, so I can just imagine how they met. But that Virginia Pope thought, oh, I know a chic woman with a disability, or a fashion designer who has a disability. So whether Cookman sort of identified that way or not. But notable, yes, that the functional fashions for the physically handicapped, is that right? Is very much the language of sort of rehabilitation medicine, defining physical disability apart from other disabilities. There's this real distinction. But I think in reality, we observe that people in those communities are paying attention to each other and like what they're doing education-wise, certainly in terms of legal rights. Jacobus Tenbroek, who I mentioned, makes a clear connection between blind people walking around and other disabled people in the world. And so they're sort of bleeding over these categories.
Yeah, I think there's this interesting element to it where, I have a cane next to me. I walk with a cane. I'm sure many of you didn't see it. I'm very clearly a disabled person who sort of passes on sort of many of these levels of the types of person that Rusk was trying to rehabilitate. And we'll probably get more into this in a little bit, but like, did rehabilitate actually mean sort of, bring the person to where the person wants to be, or did it actually mean normalizing the person? And so I can imagine how Rusk saw me. I was probably normal by his standards and his eyes. And so I imagine that in the same way, I think Helen Cookman probably passed. But we did find, and you showed me earlier today, there was a quote of Helen Cookman where she was described as being a hearing aid user. And I think that in some ways that hearing aid might have served as validation as her entry into the space. And so I think I find that interesting as well, even though it wasn't incorporated into her work in any tangible way.
Yeah, absolutely. And in that same article, I think the reporter mentioned that one of the models was in New York Fashion Week. They showed functional fashions, and in that newspaper article, which was probably dated to the 60s, the newspaper reporter is talking about some of the different disabilities of the models, and they do mention one person is using hearing aids. So yeah, it's an interesting conversation from.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think you also found a picture of the what did she call it, on the belt, the thing that held her hearing aid, and it actually makes me wonder if the picture you found might be from that, and it might be from the person. But there's so many unknowns at this point. So yeah.
One thing that I'm particularly interested in is in post-war America, that there was such a strong sort of quote-unquote self-help and do-it-yourself ethos that maybe we can describe and speak about a little bit more. And toward this ideal, I'm so curious about why it was not acceptable to rely on a person for assistance, but it was acceptable to rely on a device. And I'm especially interested in this in relation to functional fashions because the clothing line was created in essence to replace caregivers. yet it could have just as easily been branded to assist caregivers in daily dressing activities.
Yes, this is something that that I see a lot as an overlap between sort of the language of the functional fashions with other projects of Rusk, right? An intense emphasis on the idea of independence. Independence specifically referring to the idea of doing things without assistance. That is particularly strong in discussions around the rehabilitation of disabled veterans and the idea that male disabled people would not have to rely on female caregivers, that they wouldn't become vulnerable in that sense. So conversation around things like the choice of using braces as opposed to not using them and so on. And a story that I know I've told both of you before is one of my mentors, Paul Longmore, who's a sort of a very significant figure in the writing of disability history and disability activism, told me a story. He had polio as a child and was rather significantly affected by it. And at age 7, he was in Rancho Los Amigos Hospital, and they fitted him with this very elaborate brace that had to thread from one arm to the other so that he would move this arm, and then that brace would pop up so that he could try to feed himself. And he was like, this is just not happening. And they just kept pushing, and then eventually he and his mother said, no, we refuse to do it. And as a result, he said they always got a lot of pushback from their caregivers at the hospital that they were uncooperative. And I think this is the kind of story that plays out as we see these elaborate kinds of braces. Now, the clothing doesn't go to that level of elaborateness, but we can think about, again, the emphasis on doing something oneself. And Paul told me, what a significant step it was in his life to just say, I am not going to feed myself. I'm going to be fed by another person in my life. And he, continued to live his life for another 40 years after that. So, that this is particularly tied up in, I think, gender issues of the post-war period around the psychological health of men not being dependent on women, and also on the psychological health of children. There's significant, study sort of beliefs in the psychiatric community at this time that over-mothering might lead to homosexuality, for example, or other kinds of gender dysphoria. And so these are the issues that I see as sort of underlying some of the anxieties in these kinds of projects toward the idea of independence.
I think there's another angle to this too, which if you were to look at the clothing brands that have entered the disability market, you have Tommy Hilfiger, you have Target, you have Zappos, and what you will see with each of them is they each entered the market through children. And while some have expanded their lines to include adults, if you were to look at the initial clothing line, what they had put out, and you would read the language in it, what you would find is that these clothing lines that were made for children, they're actually geared toward parents. And they read in terms of helping parents dress their child. And so it does seem interesting to me that there has been a shift since that time without there being a knowing of what had happened at that time, where the entry into the space is actually to ease, you could sort of presumably say, the burden of parents, and has little, if any, focus on self-help.
I have a follow-up question about this. In the sources that I found from the period, a lot of quotes that define or describe independence almost always seem to reference the ability to dress oneself. And I wonder if dressing oneself was considered sort of the first step or the core part of this ideal of independence.
This is so interesting, and I think this partly is what you're looking for when you do research, because what I often find, so in a number of films that come out that are particularly focused on disabled veterans, and if anybody has seen the fantastic post-World War II film, The Best Years of Our Lives, which includes a disabled veteran, an actor, very publicly using two prosthetic limbs. And he's kind of reenacting other like army films that showed the rehabilitation of soldiers. And there's a lot of performing day-to-day tasks. And I'd say the most common in these images and films is smoking. In fact, the opening scene of an army training film that the same actor was in is him having to be helped to smoke by a nurse, and then at the end, he's smoking by himself using a prosthetic hand. So, we can consider so that in a sort of public sense, not to mention also like asking a woman out, shaving, tying one. There's so many sort of tasks. So there's a lot of different things there. So I would say, but that's sort of for the public performance of rehabilitation for, romantic movie audience, or even for like congressional funders. They're always talking about driving, smoking, shaving, and these are sort of the things. When it comes down to sort of actual life, that actor also, in his own personal narrative, was that he watched a film of another disabled veteran from World War I buttoning his own vest. So actually, dressing oneself may have been the actual task that people identified themselves as wanting to do, as opposed to something that maybe would read as more recognizable or something so, I mean, sometimes you have, like, there's this article that shows, like, there's often a bilateral amputees, two-armed, it's like showing off their multiple prosthetic limbs. Is a very, very small portion of the population, right? But they're always photographed, like smoking and writing their names at the same time. So it's like they're doing like as much as possible. But it strikes me that dressing is like actually sort of getting down to like, okay, you're gonna go home tomorrow. What, can you get out of bed and get dressed?
Great. Did you want to respond, Liz?
I think I'm good.
Okay. I have a question that I'm really personally curious about because of my family members. In all of the period sources that I've looked through that discuss functional fashions, I think only one that I've come across potentially references cognitive disabilities. The newspaper reporter wrote, quote, "The mentally disturbed child who tears off his clothes should have closings on the back where they are less accessible," which I find so interesting because it seems to imply reducing accessibility. And so perhaps we can discuss the persons who are not envisioned as functional fashions users and how these individuals are left out of disability and design history more broadly.
I'll start with this. I don't have the greatest knowledge of sort of many of these histories. I think Bess is definitely our historian, but I think that there is this element in what has happened. And again, right, like they were very specific in the writing of the book. This is for the physically handicapped. And I think Howard Rusk must have looked at this and he must have created criteria of who can be, in his eyes, rehabilitated. I think I've taken this really big interest right now, and this might seem a little off topic, but I find it sort of really parallel in the Paralympics. And the Paralympics kind of came of age around the same time as all this was happening. And I am incredibly active in the disability community. I have a lot of disabled friends, and I don't know of a single friend of mine who would actually qualify to participate in the Paralympics. And so, we have this massive event that happens, every couple of years, and we praise it and laud it for being the most inclusive of events. But I actually can't think of a more exclusive event than the Paralympics. And so, I think one of the things that actually happened in disability at the time was this qualifying and this determining of who can be. And again, I say rehabilitated, but it's in my eyes, I'm really thinking of who can be normalized. And I think there's something more to it. I'm not quite there yet, but that's my feeling.
Yeah, I would say, just to sort of echo that, I think the most practical answer to that is just have to do with medical specialties, right? That people are still being sort of defined through medical categories of like orthopedics. specifically in rehabilitation medicine, and like polio is a specific thread of funding, for example, or some often sort of separate sections of the hospital and so on. So I think there's some sort of practical issues there. But I think it's also, realms of taboo and the very common experience of, for mental health, psychiatric as well as, cognitive intellectual disabilities. People were often institutionalized, lobotomized, killed, right? And so you can imagine their choice of clothing was not being addressed at all, let alone even their quality of life. But for those people who were living at home in those contexts, whether caring for themselves or being cared for by family members, my guess would be that they're seeing these products, right? And they may be recognizing themselves in them and using them, or they may be noticing how much more doubly they're removed from any kind of societal concern, right? So I think but we can think about this issue of like where something is sold, what it's called, and how that both invites or excludes. But there are a few spaces of direct-to-consumer selling at this time. I haven't been able to find out that much about them, but there's this place in New York at this time that's called the Emporium for the Physically Handicapped that has all these kinds of tools and stuff selling. And I always wonder, if you knew it was there. Nobody asks you when you come into the store, like, where's your diagnosis, right? So shopping is actually sometimes we can consider shopping a kind of inclusive activity in a surprising way sometimes as well. I don't know, just one final thing to say that's a huge area. These are big areas of exploration now, however, right? The attention to sensory issues in particular as issues that cut across a wide variety of disabilities, and particularly around autism, is like a really intense area of exploration in terms of textiles and the feel of things and how they connect and so on. So I think it's also, we can note how there's kind of overlaps in medical history and design history in these fields also.
Yeah, I think, there were other things that were really interesting that happened kind of veering into the 1960s, where you had disabled populations, disabled people actually escaping institutions, really for the first time since industrialization. And so these bodies that were sort of deemed by society as atypical were being sort of experienced in society really for the first time. And I think this is also a time where there was a period of adjustment. And so, I think there's a disability theorist, her name is Simi Linton, and one of the things she talks about is she says that moment that we sort of encounter discomfort with a disabled person, it actually happens when we discover we don't know what to do. So imagine the first time you encounter a wheelchair user. Do you kneel down? Do you stay standing? Like, that is very uncomfortable for the person to go through. The same thing with you encounter a deaf person. Do you look at the sign language interpreter? Do you look at the deaf person? And so I imagine that there must have been this wariness on the part of Howard Rusk, knowing that he was going to sort of allow certain people to gain entry in society, and sort of knowing perhaps maybe that society wasn't quite ready at the time for certain bodies. I presume, I wonder if there's some element of that. I just wonder if the people who were deemed worthy of actually having these fashions, if it was actually people that sort of Rusk and others sort of felt like they could predetermine that maybe society were ready for in some way, I guess. Yeah.
My last question, maybe before, if you guys have closing statements, is really about researching and writing disability history. After several years of research, Liz and I haven't really been able to find many existing examples of the functional fashions line, despite the fact that nearly 30 designers contributed to the line over a span of 20 years. And as I mentioned in the introduction, these were really major designers in the United States, and there were some hugely powerful people within the fashion industry who are working on this. Bess, I wonder what your experience of researching disability history has been, going through these archives and looking for things and what you've been able to find or not. And more broadly, I wonder, where are all of the functional fashions?
We all want to know if anybody root around in your grandparents' attics, if any of this is sounding familiar. Yeah, I mean, I think, the deeper question here is, right, where is disability history? And it's a really significant question for the history of design, and also for like the spaces we think, like, where do we go to find history, right? My wonderful mentor at the National Museum of American History, Catherine Ott, once pointed out to me, like, what difference does it make if you have a period room, like the kind of spaces we have in historic houses, and you just put a cane in there, right? Just a reminder that disabled people have always lived, right? Have always been part of communities, but the traces are often hard to find. People sometimes don't bring that cane into their family photograph, or you can't tell if they're wearing functional fashions or whatever. So these things are very hard to find. And fashion, clothing collections in particular, almost all clothing collections, particularly, I won't qualify, but many of our fashion collections, right, focus on couture, on the sort of highest level of clothing collection. And so people are just not seeking out these clothes, but then also the question of, do we value these kinds of clothes? We can think of, what clothing do we save of our ancestors, right? It's often our wedding dresses, right? Or a few key items, right? But jewelry and so on, but not these kinds of clothes which might be associated with the end of their lives or with illness, or and so on. And then finally, I would just say, that I think the taboo around disability is significant. And just as an anecdote, as some of you may know, there's a traveling exhibition over the last few years of Frida Kahlo's clothing that was sealed in a friend's bathroom for after her death, that her husband Diego Rivera asked this sort of patron to, like, seal up this clothing, including Kahlo's corsets and braces, and she was disabled throughout her life, and a prosthetic leg that she wore for the last year of her life, all sealed up. And we don't really know why, but the question, my perception of it is that he sort of knew that people wouldn't know how to deal with this truth of her life. And now it's traveling, and it's somewhere between really significant and slightly unsettling to see these things on display. But I think that, like, if Frida Kahlo, who was, like, totally out there about her disability, clearly painting herself and her truth, if her family felt, well, maybe the world can't handle this, we can imagine the situation for, other folks who nobody was looking to find out what they were wearing, after their deaths. So. That said, I believe you'll find some things.
I mean, it's perplexing to me. I mean, this went on for decades, with dozens of designers, and, like, nothing, right? You go onto eBay, nothing. And where it's led me is, I'm utterly convinced that these archives exist somewhere in their entirety. I'm convinced. But it's not to say that the process has been frustrating, because it's actually not been at all. I mean, you sort of encounter wildly fascinating people. Earlier this week, Natalie and I were emailing with the grandson of Andrew Goodman of Bergdorf Goodman's, because he was on the board of the Clothing Research and Development Foundation. But I have this particularly favorite story of this process. And so these are 2 letters that I received from Rod Behrens, who is Helen Cookman's grandson. And if you look on the left, you'll see that it's a letter between Conrad Behrens and Howard Rusk. So Conrad was one of Rod's his other grandfather. So Helen and Conrad were friends, but they were not married. And Conrad was a world-famous ophthalmologist. So if you look at the picture on the right, or the letter on the right, you'll see a letter from Conrad to Conrad from Helen. So Rod sends me this letter, right, and I'm looking at it, and I get this email from him, and he basically said, oops, that letter is not actually from Helen Cookman, it's from Helen Keller. And it's striking to me. Like, this was a family that was sort of deeply immersed in disability culture. They lived in New York in this really exciting time. They encountered really exciting people, the heights of fashion, right, and also the heights of disability. And it's so much fun to kind of discover and get really excited about these kind of idiosyncrasies within the story. And so I'm convinced we'll find it. I feel like it's out there. I feel like it's a trove. And in the meantime, like, I get to read letters from Helen Keller. Like, it's cool.
And I'll just add, we haven't spoken about fashion photography yet, but there are so many photographs of functional fashions, in particular by a fashion photographer named Marianne Stevenson, or Marianne Stevenson Patmore. And she was a very well-known fashion photographer, and we're still also looking for those images as well. She has a really interesting story where she had this great career, and she passed away in a car crash in New York, and she was married, but she didn't have any children, and none of the museums have her archives that I know of, or I haven't been able to find her archives of her work. And this is relatively recent history that we're trying to find, and things hopefully don't just disappear. So we're looking to find them. Should we open it up to questions for the audience?
Thank you so much. The question I have is, did you look at other Western countries like England and Canada in terms of where they were at with this type of research, or?
I'm Canadian, so I'm particularly excited about that. And there is one newspaper article from the Ottawa Journal, I think, in Canada, and actually there's also press in Edmonton about functional fashions. So this, I was looking mostly at functional fashions related things, and so there was press in Canada about the functional fashions line, and including, I think, some fashion shows where they were showing these designs in these places in Canada. But I'm not exactly sure in terms of the design movements if there was more going on in other countries. I just know more about the spread of functional fashions and where this press was being published.
And yeah, just to say briefly, there is one of the things that has always been attractive to me about studying the history of disability and design is it's quite distinct in different countries, right? Whereas, I don't know, in some ways we think like, oh, we all have the same stuff in like the 21st century, but as any of you may be able to attest, there's quite different cultures of access in terms of what we expect because of legal differences. But those also reflect sort of other national differences. And so in Europe in particular, it's a very different situation after the war than in the United States, right? Where the United States is all about sort of the recovery of the disabled veteran, but there hasn't been widespread civilian injury and death or destruction of buildings and so on. So there's not this sense that the entire society needs to be redesigned. And so there's more of a focus on sort of individual disabilities. And the US has always been sort of more engaged in accessible design, particularly focused on, as we mentioned, the idea of independence. And so in Europe, you have a lot of design projects that focus on sort of entire design, sort of total communities for disabled people, for example, an entire sort of village in the Netherlands for disabled people, using sort of the best of modernist design after in the 1950s, but this is very much based on a kind of social welfare model of support, which we could see as both supportive and segregated, right, in terms of a kind of institutional living. So there's still sort of traces of those different design cultures in different countries.
As an individual with a disability, I'm curious how the American Disability Act of 1990 impacted the legacy of Howard Rusk, and as well as this fashion industry of design disabilities in general.
Yeah, it's such a great question, right? We're way before that in many ways, although in some ways I think we're kind of like on the road there. One main distinction that I would make is between public design and private design, that the advent of the idea of public accommodations that we're familiar with today, like, the wheelchair ramp entrances and just sort of the things that we're familiar with seeing everywhere, are particularly regulated in the public environment, but not so much in private space, right? So your own apartment may not be accessible, whereas a museum is or whatever. And so things like clothing, kitchen appliances, these sorts of things are not regulated by any legal requirement to be accessible. So there's always a kind of, many designers observe a kind of tension there, right? Because on the one hand, accessible codes and laws that govern architecture move the field forward quite a bit, but they tend to be associated with everything we associate government regulations with, which is to say boring, ugly, an add-on. Whereas these kinds of designs, really tap into the creative energy of making something new voluntarily. So those tensions often are sort of existing in these fields. But just to be clear that these were not required by law, and they still are not required by law.
I encountered a really interesting story. I think it was maybe 2 or 3 weeks ago. So, and we can kind of look at this through the through line of sort of my argument in this. So, Lego decided that they were going to create a Braille brick, and they are going to give them away to various institutions around the world. And if you look at it from sort of my perspective of what I say oftentimes is the things that we radically fight for turn into things that are empathetically done for us. So the Lego came out with this Braille brick without acknowledging that they'd existed in the disability community since the 1980s, and they were called tactiles. But the really interesting thing was, and this is sort of kind of how I see how the ADA kind of bumps up against consumerism. So they create Braille bricks, right, for blind people, and they announce it on Twitter with a video. And there's no words, it's just visuals. And so they made a video that can only be seen, it can't be experienced in any other way. And so you would presume that there should be some protection in the ADA to cover that and ensure that blind people would be able to access, at the very least, the launch video of a product for blind people. So I do wonder how, kind of from a consumer and purchasing and choice perspective, I don't necessarily know that anybody would be covered by the ADA, but you would expect, at least from an information perspective, that should happen, but it's not happening yet.
Thank you all. It was a very fascinating panel. I wondered if you guys could speak more along the lines of, at this time, segregation, so racial accessibility as well as financial accessibility of this clothing line, beyond catering to different disabilities.
I'll start on this one, and then I'm going to push it on to you. So there is it's Building Access, Amy Hamray's book? Yeah, so Amy Hamray, again, she's another person who does a lot of really good work in this space, has a book called Building Access. And in the book, one of the things she talks about is how this notion of design for all it was kind of created as a result of the No Barriers movement, but it happened at a time when the United States was still segregated, right? And so who was all in Design for All, right? It was white people, upper middle class, who had access to, public spaces. And so I think there is much that we haven't reckoned with in the space in terms of various forms of segregation. I think I look at, in terms of economic insinuations, I look at it a little bit more complexly. I do worry that there's this, that we have this idea of for all kind of pushed on us, so that if you come up with a specific solution, that everybody must be able to access it. But I also think that there are elements of disability culture, art, which can't necessarily have a price tag. And so I do wish we could have sort of multiple complex conversations. Like, yes, people should have access to the things that they need. I think people should have, be able to aspire, right, and have that within their means. But I think in that way, like, it's really difficult to say, like, you know, who is something for it. There, you know, yeah, that's what I've got. Your turn.
Yeah, just to speak about, you're absolutely right to pick up on the idea that this is sort of occurring in a moment of segregation in the United States, and we might consider that much of the research around accessibility in the U.S. took place in segregated spaces. So in focus on in education. So in school, for example, at the University of Illinois in Urbana-Champaign was sort of has remained a kind of significant site for wheelchair access, but was, if not legally segregated in the 1950s, was sort of de facto segregated. And in reference to housing, right? So then there's this focus on the sort of the single family house as the model for domestic accessibility, and those single family houses were almost entirely available only to white people through the practices of redlining and legal segregation in some parts of the country, right? So, so the very definition of accessible space is tied up in, and I would say also, as I sort of suggested, right, that there's a very normative message here that to be rehabilitated as a woman is to return to very distinct gender. Actually, I should say, cut in both ways, for men as well, as like very strongly gendered. And so there's a kind of almost a double enforcement of expected norms of race, class, and gender and sexuality that occur through the practices of rehabilitation and sort of what's available to you. And I would say further that the two populations that I mentioned, disabled veterans and polio survivors, also are heavily sort of inflected by race, where polio hospitals were primarily segregated, especially in the South, so that we literally have very poor records or even a sense statistically of how many Black people had polio. It was perceived for a long time that it was a sort of white middle class disease that I think has been largely debunked, but instead it was just that it was only diagnosed because polio presents as kind of a bad cold. And some people just sort of have a bad cold and then go on and aren't really affected with the long term, or they die. And I think that we don't know what the reality for many populations. So just anyway, not to continue that too long, but I think these spaces absolutely reflect that. Yeah, and so yes.
Can I add one more thing to it, or are we out of time?
No, in terms of functional fashions, we see a number of photographs of African American models wearing the clothing, but children, I would say. And I wonder if there is an age distinction. So women's wear and men's wear, you don't see as much diversity in the models, but with children's wear, you do. And then the other thing that I wanted to add, just in terms of the economics question, Helen Cookman does state that it's her goal for sort of all disabled Americans to be beautifully dressed at all price ranges. So she really wants to collaborate with designers to create clothing at different price points. So like one of the slides that I had up, it's a suit with a skirt and sort of a wheelchair lap robe. And that was a Vera Maxwell design that would have been really expensive, for example. It was like black seal fur lined and has beautifully blue tweed. And so it sort of ranges from the very high end to maybe something like Levi's. I think those were like $24, $25 those flare jeans in the 70s. But just to say explicitly that she does say in lots of press articles that that's her goal.
It was interesting. I mentioned to Bess earlier because I was really struck by the fact that there were 2 black children, and it was these. What was the event that they were in?
Yeah, when Helen Cookman finished her research residency at the Institute for Physical Medicine and Rehabilitation with Dr. Rusk, I think it's them presenting functional fashions to the press, probably in 1955.
Yeah, so I think I was really struck. Like, why are there? I didn't know why are there 2 black children in here, and so I had asked Bess, and Bess was like, "Well, of course, like they're institutionalized, right? So like segregation doesn't necessarily apply to institutionalization." So, yeah. I guess. Yeah, but it's striking because you don't see anybody older than children who are people of color in any way.
Thank you. I'm an occupational therapist, so this has an interesting perspective that we are aware of much of, but obviously not to this degree. But I had 2 questions. When you talked about what Rusk and Cookman designed, did that go to scale where people were able to purchase it en masse? And then secondly, kind of on a practical level, currently for my patients, who can I direct them to now for options that's also sort of reasonable in terms of cost? Because that's usually the hardest part.
If I could just speak to the first question about scale, I think that a couple things happened. After Helen Cookman and Howard Rusk presented that, basically Helen Cookman's pilot line of functional fashions, a huge number of Americans inquired about purchasing options for that line. The number varies in press articles, but roughly around 30,000 people inquired, which is a huge number. And so then I think that's when she sort of realized that there was a business opportunity and a need that she could fill of beautiful clothing that was also accessible. And so that's when she began collaborating. I think she believed that she could reach more of an audience if she collaborated with multiple designers. But there was a booklet that you could, basically you could write to their foundation, the Clothing Research and Development Foundation, to receive by mail this booklet to show what you could purchase from the functional fashions line, and that's on display in the functional fashions display. So I think they made it scalable that way by really working hard to engage the press and then to direct buyers to purchase the line that way. What we really don't know yet is how many people purchased and wore the garments, and if they actually needed to alter the garments themselves. That I'm also really curious about that.
And as this is a mystery, was there 200 letters, or how many letters did you say she got?
Like 30,000, and then
there was
like 500 from organizations, I think.
Yeah, and those are missing. Yeah.
But just to, because I was sort of new to this subject as well, but they were sold in the Sears catalog. Yeah. So they were, I mean, one of the things Natalie was telling me was, Helen Cookman was very insistent, like they should be sold in stores, broadly, and our sense is that didn't happen. They were in the Sears catalog, but in the back, in the like medical section, in independent living, as we call it now, sort of section. So, this question of stream, but I think the Sears catalog is pretty significant. Of course, those papers were lost in a fire, so we don't know how many people ordered from the Sears catalog. But these are really good questions. In terms of Liz may have better ideas, but there are, adaptive fashion that's kind of, a little staid that's available through like Zappos or
Tommy Hilfiger and so on. But there's some, I'll just give a shout out to a graduate of the School of the Art Institute where I teach. If you have any young, hip clients, there's a great company called Rebirth Garments that sells on Etsy. That's a little expensive because it's like small shop made in Chicago, but it's like basically your like club wear that's in like all different stretchy materials, and it's all gender, and it can be custom made, and you've got like all different shapes and sizes. And I feel like Sky Kubakub, who runs that, is really doing like a lot of significant work to represent disability culture. That said, I imagine for many people it might be like a one piece from that line, price point wise.
Yeah, I think, I think the thing that we are looking at here and what you're also experiencing is it's the full spectrum of the human body. And so I think I naively, I'm sure even this is what I imagine Helen and Virginia were grappling with. You sort of assume like, okay, maybe there could be a place, right? Like a place, you can go to and you can get all your disabled needs, right? But I think about, well, then, like, okay, like what is an accessible product? What is an adaptive product? And I look at the straw ban right now. So plastic straws are needed by millions of people all over the world who require it to simply consume liquids. And there are many bans that are happening. And there's this interesting sort of thing that's happening where in order to access a straw now, you need to request one. And for me, I look at it and I think to myself, this is how a need becomes special, right? Like you're going to need to say, oh, I need that in order to access it. And so you think about what could come or go from this place at any point in time, and suddenly straws, which were available everywhere, may have entered this hypothetical depot. So, I think this is really why I have kind of fallen into disability culture and embraced it as I have, because what you find you find the same creative solutions that you probably encounter and know yourself on a daily basis. I think, it's interesting. I found myself in this space because I wanted a cool cane, and the thing that resonates most with me are sort of various T-shirts that come out of disability culture. So access is love, or I have a friend who made a T-shirt that said "faking it" that she takes to the doctor, right? And so I think there's this element of humor. So if you have a specific need, I don't imagine there would be a go-to place. It couldn't possibly exist. But if you want to delight, I'd say try entering disability culture.